and with eyes that were full of majesty and wisdom, and limbs that were full of strength and speed, the king's centaur stood above him. "O my lord," the slave said, "I have come before thee sent by Æson, my master, who told me where to come and what blasts to blow upon the horn. And Æson, once king of Iolcus, bade me to say to thee that if thou dost remember his ancient friendship with thee, thou wilt perchance take this child and guard and foster him, and as he grows instruct him with thy wisdom. For Æson's sake I will rear and foster this child," said Chiron, the king's centaur, in a deep voice. The child lying on the moss had been looking up at the four-footed and two-handed centaur. Now the slave lifted him up and placed him in the centaur's arms. He said, "Æson bade me tell thee that the child's name is Jason. He bade me give thee this ring with the great ruby in it, that thou mayest give it to the child when he is grown. By this ring with its ruby and the images engraved on it, Æson may know his son when they meet after many years and many changes. And another thing Æson bade me say to the owner, not little, that he knows that this child has to regard the immortal goddess Hera, the wife of Zeus." Chiron held Æson's son in his arms, and the little child put hands into his great beard. Then the centaur said, "Let Æson know that his son will be reared and fostered by me, and that when they meet again, there will be ways by which they will be known to each other." Saying this, Chiron the centaur, holding the child in his arms, went swiftly toward the forest arches. Then the slave took up the horn and went down the side of the mountain Pelion. He came to where a horse was hidden, and he mounted and rode, first to a city, and then to a village that was beyond the city. All this was before the famous walls of Troy were built, before King Priam had come to the throne of his father, and while he was still known, not as Priam, but as Peroses. And the beginning of all these happenings was in Iolcus, a city in Thessaly. Cretheus founded the city and had ruled over it in days before King Priam was born. He left two sons, Æson and Peleus. Æson succeeded his father, and because he was a mild and gentle man, the men of war did not love Æson. They wanted a hard king who would lead them to conquests. Peleus, the brother of Æson, was ever with the men of war. He knew what mind they had toward Æson, and he plotted with them to overthrow his brother. This they did, and they brought Peleus to reign as king in Iolcus. The people loved Æson, and they feared Peleus. And because the people loved him and would be maddened by his slaying, Peleus and the men of war left him living. With his wife Alcimede and his infant son, Æson went from the city, and in a village that was a distance from Iolcus, he found a hidden house and went to dwell in it. Æson would have lived content there, were it not that he was fearful for Jason, his infant son. Jason, he knew, would grow into a strong and a bold youth, and Peleus the king would be made uneasy on his account. Peleus would slay the son, and perhaps would slay the father for the son's sake, when his memory would come to be less loved by the people. Æson thought of such things in his hidden house, and he pondered on ways to have his son reared away from Iolcus, and the dread and the power of King Peleus. He had for a friend one who was the wisest of all creatures, Chiron the centaur. Chiron who was half man and half horse. Chiron who had lived and was yet to live measureless years. Chiron had fostered Heracles, and it might be that he would not refuse to foster Jason, Æson's child. Away in the fastnesses of Mount Pelion Chiron dwelt. Once Æson had been with him and had seen the centaur hunt with his great bow and his great spears. And Æson knew a way that one might come to him. Chiron himself had told him of the way. Now there was a slave in his house who had been Æson, and who knew all the ways of the mountain Pelion. Æson talked with the slave one day, and after he had talked with him, he sat for a long time over the cradle of his sleeping infant. And then he spoke to Alcimede, his wife, telling her of the parting that made her weep. That evening the slave came in, and Æson took the child from the arms of the mournful-eyed mother and put him in the slave's arms. Also he gave him a horn and a ring with a great ruby in it, and mystic images engraved on its gold. Then, when the ways were dark, the slave mounted a horse, and with the child in his arms rode to the city that King Pelias ruled over. In the morning he came to that mountain that is covered with forest, the mountain Pelias. And that evening he came back to the village and to Æson's hidden house, and he told his master how he had prospered. Æson was content thereafter, although he was lonely, and although his wife was lonely in their childlessness. But the time came when they rejoiced that their child had been sent into an unreachable place. For messengers from King Pelias came inquiring about the boy. They told the king's messengers that the child had strayed off from his nurse, and that whether he had been slain by a wild beast or had been drowned in the swift river Anaurus, they did not know. The years went by, and Pelias felt secure upon the throne he had taken from his brother. Once he sent to the oracle of the gods to ask of it whether he should be fearful of anything. What the oracle answered was this, that King Pelias had but one thing to dread, the coming of a half-shod man. The centaur nourished the child Jason on roots and fruits and honey. For shelter, they had a great cave that Chiron had lived in for numberless years. When he had grown big enough to leave the cave, Chiron would let Jason mount on his back. With the child holding on to his great mane, he would trot gently through the ways of the forest. Jason began to know the creatures of the forest and their haunts. Sometimes Chiron would bring his great bow with him. Then Jason on his back would hold the quiver and would hand him the arrows. The centaur would let the boy see him kill with a single arrow the bear, the boar, or the deer. And soon Jason, running beside him, hunted too. No heroes were ever better trained than those whose childhood and youth had been spent with Chiron, the king centaur. He made them more swift of foot than any other of the children of men. He made them stronger and more ready with the spear and bow. Jason was trained by Chiron as Heracles just before him had been trained, and as Achilles was to be trained afterward. Moreover, Chiron taught him the knowledge of the stars, and the wisdom that had to do with the ways of the gods. Once when they were hunting together, Jason saw a form at the end of an alley of trees. The form of a woman it was, of a woman who had on her head a shining crown. Never had Jason dreamt of seeing a form so wondrous. Not very near did he come, but he thought he knew that the woman smiled upon him. She was seen no more, and Jason knew that he had looked upon one of the immortal goddesses. All day Jason was filled with thought of her whom he had seen. At night, when the stars were out, and when they were seated outside the cave, Chiron and Jason talked together, and Chiron told the youth that she whom he had seen was none other than Hera, the wife of Zeus, who had for his father Æson and for himself an especial friendliness. So Jason grew up upon the mountain and in the forest of Atlases. When he had reached his full height and had shown himself swift in the hunt and strong with the spear and bow, Chiron told him that the time had come when he should go back to the world of men and make his name famous by the doing of great deeds. And when Chiron told him about his father Æson, about how he had been thrust out of the kingship by Pelias, his uncle, a great longing came upon Jason to see his father, and a fierce anger grew up in his heart against Pelias. Then the time came when he bade goodbye to Chiron, his great instructor, and the time came when he went from the centaur's cave for the last time, and went through the wooded ways and down the side of the mountain Pelion. He came to the river, to the swift Anaurus, and he found it high in blood. The stones by which one might cross were almost all washed over. Far apart did they seem in the flood. Now, as he stood there pondering on what he might do, there came up to him an old woman, who had on her back a load of brushwood. "Wouldst thou cross?" asked the old woman. "Wouldst thou cross and get thee to the city of Iolcus, Jason, where so many things await thee?" Greatly was the youth astonished to hear his name spoken by this old woman, and to hear her give the name of the city he was bound for. "Wouldst thou cross the Anaurus?" she asked again. "Then mount upon my back. holding on to the wood I carry, and I will bear thee over the river." Jason smiled. How foolish this old woman was to think that she could bear him across the flooded river. She came near to him, and she took him in her arms and lifted him up on her shoulders. Then, before he knew what she was about to do, she had stepped into the water. From stone to stepping stone she went, Jason holding on to the wood that she had drawn to her shoulders. She left him down upon the bank. As she was lifting him down, one of his feet touched the water. The swift current swept away a sandal. He stood on the bank, knowing that she who had carried him across the river had strength from the gods. He looked upon her, and behold, she was transformed. Instead of an old woman, there stood before him one who had on a golden robe and a shining crown. Around her was a wondrous light, the light of the sun when it is most golden. Then Jason knew that she who had carried him across the broad Norris was the goddess whom he had seen in the ways of the forest, Hera, great Zeus's wife. "Go into Iolcus, Jason," said great Hera to him. "Go into Iolcus, and in whatever chance doth befall thee, act as one who has the eyes of the immortals upon him." She spoke, and she was seen no more. Then Jason went on his way to the city that Cretheus, his grandfather, had founded, and that his father Aeson had once ruled over. He came into that city, a tall, great-limbed, unknown youth, dressed in a strange fashion, and having but one sandal on. End of section 1. Recording by Elizabeth Platt. The Golden Fleece, and the Heroes Who Lived Before Achilles, by Parik Kola. Part 1, Chapter 2, King Peleus. That day King Peleus, walking through the streets of his city, saw coming toward him a youth who was half-shod. He remembered the words of the oracle that bade him beware of a half-shod man, and straightway he gave orders to his guards to lay hands upon the youth. But the guards wavered when they went toward him, for there was something about the youth that put them in awe of him. He came with the guards, however, and he stood before the king's judgment seat. Fearfully did Peleus look upon him, but not fearfully did the youth look upon the king. With head lifted high he cried out, "Thou art Peleus, but I do not salute thee as king. Know that I am Jason, the son of Aeson, from whom thou hast taken the throne and scepter that were rightfully his." King Peleus looked at his guards. He would have given them a sign to destroy the youth's life with their spears, but behind his guards he saw a threatening multitude, the dwellers of the city of Iolcus. They gathered around, and Peleus knew that he had become more and more hated by them. And from the multitude a cry went up, "Aeson! Aeson! May Aeson come back to us! Jason, son of Aeson! May nothing evil befall thee, brave youth!" Then Peleus knew that the youth might not be slain. He bent his head while he plotted against him in his heart. Then he raised his eyes, and looking upon Jason, he said, "O goodly youth, it well may be that thou art the son of Aeson, my brother. I am well pleased to see thee here. I have had hopes that I might be friends with Aeson, and my coming here may be the means to the renewal of our friendship. We two brothers may come together again. I will send for thy father now, and he will be brought to meet me in my royal palace. Go with my guards and with this rejoicing people, and in a little while thou and I and thy father Aeson will sit at a feast of friends." So Peleus said, and Jason went with the guards and the crowd of people, and he came to the palace of the king, and he was brought within. The maids led him to the bath and gave him new robes to wear. Dressed in these, Jason looked a prince indeed. But all that while King Peleus remained on his judgment seat with his crowned head bent down. When he raised his head, his dark brows were gathered together, and his thin lips were very close. He looked to the swords and spears of his guards, and he made a sign to the men to stand close to him. Then he left the judgment seat, and he went to the palace. End of section 2. Recording by Elizabeth Platt. The Golden Fleece, and the heroes who lived before Achilles, by Parth Coleman. Part 1, Chapter 3, The Golden Fleece. They brought Jason into a hall where Æson, his father, waited. Very strange did this old and grave-looking man appear to him. But when Æson spoke, Jason remembered, even without the sight of the ruby ring, the tone of his father's voice, and he clasped him to him. And his father knew him, even without the sight of the ruby ring which Jason had upon his finger. Then the young man began to tell of the centaur, and of his life upon the mountain Pelion. As they were speaking together, Peleus came to where they stood, Peleus in the purple robe of a king, and with the crown upon his head. Æson tightly clasped Jason, as if he had become fearful for his son. Peleus smilingly took the hand of the young man, and the hand of his brother, and he bade them both welcome to his palace. Then, walking between them, the king brought the two into the feasting hall. The youth, who had known only the forest and the mountainside, had to wonder at the beauty and magnificence of all he saw around him. On the walls were bright pictures. The tables were of polished wood, and they had vessels of gold and dishes of silver set upon them. Along the walls were vases of lovely shapes and colors, and everywhere there were baskets heaped with roses, white and red. The king's guests were already in the hall, young men and elders, and maidens went amongst them, carrying roses which they strung into wreaths for the guests to put upon their heads. A soft-handed maiden gave Jason a wreath of roses, and he put it on his head as he sat down at the king's table. When he looked at all the rich and lovely things in the hall, and when he saw the guests looking at him with friendly eyes, Jason felt that he was indeed far away from the dim spaces of the mountain forest, and from the darkness of the centaur's cave. Rich food and wine such as he had never dreamt of tasting were brought to the tables. He ate and drank, and his eyes followed the fair maidens who went through the hall. He thought how glorious it was to be a king. He heard Peleus speak to Æson, his father, telling him that he was old, and that he was weary of ruling, that he longed to make friends, and that he would let no enmity now be between him and his brother. And he heard the king say that he, Jason, was young and courageous, and that he would call upon him to help to rule the land, and that in a while Jason would bear full sway over the kingdom that Cretheus had founded. So Peleus spoke to Æson as they both sat together at the king's high table. But Jason, looking on them both, saw that the eyes that his father turned on him were full of warnings and mistrust. After they had eaten, King Peleus made a sign, and a cupbearer bringing a richly wrought cup came and stood before the king. The king stood up, holding the cup in his hands, and all in the hall waited silently. Then Peleus put the cup into Jason's hands, and he cried out in a voice that was heard all through the hall, "Drink from this cup, O nephew Jason. Drink from this cup, O man who will soon come to rule over the kingdom that Cretheus founded." All in the hall stood up and shouted with delight at that speech. But the king was not delighted with their delight, Jason thought. He took the cup and he drank the rich wine. Pride grew in him. He looked down the hall and he saw faces all friendly to him. He felt as a king might feel, secure and triumphant. And then he heard King Peleus speaking once more. "This is my nephew Jason, reared and fostered in the centaur's cave. He will tell you of his life in the forest and the mountains, his life that was like to the life of the half-gods." Then Jason spoke to them, telling them of his life on the mountain Pelion. When he had spoken, Peleus said, "I was bidden by the oracle to beware of the man whom I should see coming toward me half-shod. But as you all see, I have brought the half-shod man to my palace and my feasting hall. So little do I dread the anger of the gods. And I dread it little because I am blameless. This youth, the son of my brother, is strong and courageous, and I rejoice in his strength and courage, for I would have him take my place and reign over you. I, that I were as young as he is now. I, that I had been reared and fostered as he was reared and fostered, the wise centaur and under the eyes of the immortals. Then would I do that which in my youth I often dreamed of doing. Then would I perform a deed that would make my name and the name of my city famous throughout all Greece. Then would I bring from far Colchis the famous fleece of gold that King Aeetes keeps guard over. He finished speaking, and all in the hall shouted out, "The golden fleece! The golden fleece from Colchis!" Jason stood up, and his father's hand gripped him. But he did not heed the hold of his father's hand, for "the golden fleece! The golden fleece!" rang in his ears, and before his eyes were the faces of those who were all eager for the sight of the wonder that King Aeetes kept guard over. Then said Jason, "Thou hast spoken well, O King Peleus. Know, and know all here assembled, that I have heard of the golden fleece, and of the dangers that await on anyone who should strive to win it from King Aeetes' care. But know too that I would strive to win the fleece and bring it to Iolcus, winning fame both for myself and for the city." When he had spoken, he saw his father's stricken eyes. They were fixed upon him. But he looked from them to the shining eyes of the young men who were even then pressing around where he stood. "Jason! Jason!" they shouted. "The golden fleece for Iolcus!" "King Peleus knows that the winning of the golden fleece is a feat most difficult," said Jason. "But if he will have built for me a ship that can make the voyage to far Colchis, and if he will send throughout all Greece the word of my adventuring, so that all the heroes who would win fame might come with me, and if ye, young heroes of Iolcus, will come with me, I will peril my life to win the wonder that King Aeetes keeps guard over." He spoke, and those in the hall shouted again and again, and made clamor around him. But still his father sat gazing at him with stricken eyes. King Peleus stood up in the hall, and holding up his scepter, he said, "O my nephew Jason, and O friends assembled here, I promise that I will have built for the voyage the best ship that ever sailed from a harbor in Greece. And I promise that I will send throughout all Greece a word telling of Jason's voyage, so that all heroes desirous of winning fame may come to help him, and to help all of you who may go with him to win from the keeping of King Aeetes the famous fleece of gold." So King Peleus said, but Jason, looking to the king from his father's stricken eyes, saw that he had been led by the king into the acceptance of the voyage so that he might fare far from Iolcus, and perhaps lose his life in striving to gain the wonder that King Aeetes kept guarded. By the glitter in Peleus' eyes he knew the truth. Nevertheless, Jason would not take back one word that he had spoken. His heart was strong within him, and he thought that with the help of the bright-eyed youths around, and with the help of those who would come to him at the word of the voyage, he would bring the golden fleece to Iolcus, and make famous for all time his own name. End of section 3.
Vox.org. The Golden Fleece and the Heroes Who Lived Before Achilles by Parrot Column. Section 4. The Assembling of the Heroes and the Building of the Ship. First there came the youths Castor and Polydeuces. They came riding on white horses, two noble-looking brothers. From Sparta they came, and their mother was Leda, who, after the twin brothers, had another child born to her, Helen, for whose sake the sons of many of Jason's friends were to wage war against the great city of Troy. These were the first heroes who came to Iolcus after word had gone forth through Greece of Jason's adventuring in quest of the golden fleece. And then there came one who had both welcome and reverence from Jason. This one came without spear or bow, bearing in his hands a lyre only. He was Orpheus, and he knew all the ways of the gods and all the stories of the gods. When he sang to his lyre, the trees would listen, and the beasts would follow him. It was Chiron who had counseled Orpheus to go with Jason. Chiron the centaur had met him as he was wandering through the forest on the mountain Pelion, and had sent him down into Iolcus. Then there came 2 men well skilled in the handling of ships, Tiphys and Nauplius. Tiphys knew all about the sun and winds and stars, and all about the signs by which a ship might be steered, and Nauplius had the love of Poseidon, the god of the sea. Afterward there came, one after the other, 2 who were famous for their hunting. No 2 could be more different than these 2 were. The first was Arcas. He was dressed in the skin of a bear. He had red hair and savage-looking eyes, and for arms he carried a mighty bow with bronze-tipped arrows. The folk were watching an eagle as he came into the city, an eagle that was winging its way far, far up in the sky. Arcas drew his bow, and with 1 arrow he brought the eagle down. The other hunter was a girl, Atalanta. Tall and bright-haired was Atalanta, swift and good with a bow. She had dedicated herself to Artemis, the guardian of the wild things, and she had vowed that she would remain unwedded. All the heroes welcomed Atalanta as a comrade, and the maiden did all the things that the young men did. There came a hero who was less youthful than Castor or Polydeuces. He was a man good in counsel named Nestor. Afterward Nestor went to the war against Troy, and then he was the oldest of the heroes in the camp of Agamemnon. 2 brothers came who were to be special friends of Jason's, Peleus and Telamon. Both were still youthful, and neither had yet achieved any notable deed. Afterward they were to be famous, but their sons were to be even more famous. For the son of Telamon was the strong Aias, and the son of Peleus was the great Achilles. Another who came was Admetus. Afterward he became a famous king. The god Apollo once made himself a shepherd, and he kept the flocks of King Admetus. And there came 2 brothers, twins, who were a wonder to all who beheld them. Thetis and Calais they were named. Their mother was Eurathia, the daughter of Erechtheus, king of Athens, and their father was Boreas, the north wind. These 2 brothers had on their ankles wings that gleamed with golden scales. Their black hair was thick upon their shoulders, and it was always being shaken by the wind. With Thetis and Calais there came a youth armed with a great sword, whose name was Theseus. Theseus's father was an unknown king. He had bidden the mothers show their son where his sword was hidden. Under a great stone the king had hidden it before Theseus was born. Before he had grown out of his boyhood, Theseus had been able to raise the stone and draw forth his father's sword. As yet he had done no great deed, but he was resolved to win fame and find his unknown father. On the day that the messengers had set out to bring through Greece the word of Jason's going forth in quest of the golden fleece, the woodcutters made their way up into the forest of Mount Pelion. They began to fell trees for the timbers of the ship that was to make the voyage to far Colchis. Great timbers were cut and brought down to Pagasae, the harbor of Iolcus. On the night of the day he had helped to bring them down, Jason had a dream. He dreamt that she, whom he had seen in the forest ways, and afterward by the river Naras, appeared to him. And in his dream the goddess bade him rise early in the morning and welcome a man whom he would meet at the city's gate. A tall and gray-haired man who would have in his shoulders tools for the building of the ship. He went to the city's gate and he met such a man. Argus was his name. He told Jason that a dream had sent him to the city of Iolcus. Jason welcomed him and lodged him in the king's palace. And that day the word went through the city that the building of the great ship would soon be begun. But not with the timbers brought from Mount Pelion did Argus begin. Walking through the palace with Jason, he noted a great beam in the roof. That beam, he said, had been shown him in his dream. It was from an oak tree in Dodona, the grove of Zeus. A sacred power was in the beam, and from it the prow of the ship should be fashioned. Jason had them take the beam from the roof of the palace. It was brought to where the timber. and the other figures were wrought around the figure of fear, strife and pursuit and flight, tumult and panic and slaughter. The figure of Fate was there, dragging a dead man by the feet. On her shoulders, Fate had a garment that was red with the blood of men. Around these figures were heads of snakes, heads with black jaws and glittering eyes, 12 heads such as might affright any man. And on other parts of the shield were shown the horses of Ares, the grim god of war. Dolphins swam in the sea, fishing for little fishes that were shown there in bronze. Around the rim, chariots were racing along with wheels close together. There were men fighting and women watching from high towers. The awful figure of the darkness of death was shown there too, with mournful eyes and the dust of battle upon her shoulders. The outer rim of the shield showed the stream of ocean, the stream that encircles the world. Swans were soaring above and swimming on its surface. All in wonder the heroes gazed on the great shield, telling each other that only one man in all the world could carry it, Heracles, the son of Zeus. Could it be that Heracles had come amongst them? They went into the feasting hall, and they saw one hero in the world, and he took the hand of each in his mighty hand. End of section 4.
Recording by Elizabeth Platt. The Golden Fleece and the Heroes Who Lived Before Achilles by Park Cole. Part 1, Chapter 5. The Argo. The heroes went the next day through the streets of Iolcus down to where the ship lay. The ways they went through were crowded. The heroes were splendid in their appearance, and Jason amongst them shone like a star. The people praised him, and one told the other that it would not be long until they would win back to Iolcus, for this band of heroes was strong enough, they said, to take King Aeetes' city and force him to give up to them the famous fleece of gold. Many of the bright-eyed youths of Iolcus went with the heroes who had come from different parts of Greece. As they marched past a temple, a priestess came forth to speak to Jason. Iphias was her name. She had a prophecy to utter about the voyage. But Iphias was very old, and she stammered in her speech to Jason. What she said was not heard by him. The heroes went on, and ancient Iphias was left standing there as the old are left by the young. The heroes went aboard the Argo. They took their seats as at an assembly. Then Jason faced them and spoke to them. Heroes of the quest, said Jason, we have come aboard the great ship that Argus has built, and all that a ship needs is in its place, or is ready to our hands. All that we wait for now is the coming of the morning's breeze that will set us on our way to far Colchis. One thing we have first to do, that is, to choose a leader who will direct us all, one who will settle disputes amongst ourselves, and who will make treaties between us and the strangers that we come amongst. We must choose such a leader now. Jason spoke, and some looked to him, and some looked to Heracles. But Heracles stood up, and stretching out his hand, said, Argonauts, let no one amongst you offer the leadership to me. I will not take it. The hero who brought us together and made all things ready for our going. It is he and no one else who should be our leader in this voyage. So Heracles said, and the Argonauts all stood up and raised a cry for Jason. Then Jason stepped forward, and he took the hand of each Argonaut in his hand, and he swore that he would lead them with all the mind and all the courage that they possessed. And he prayed the gods that it would be given to him to lead them back safely, with the golden fleece glittering on the map of the Argo. They drew lots for the benches they would sit at. They took the places that for the length of the voyage they would have on the ship. They made sacrifice to the gods, and they waited for the breeze of the morning that would help them away from Iolcus. And while they waited, Aeson, the father of Jason, sat at his own hearth, bowed and silent in his grief. Alcimede, his his wife sat near him, but she was not silent. She lamented to the women of Iolcus who were gathered around her. "I did not go down to the ship," she said, "for with my grief I would not be a bird of ill omen for the voyage. By this heart my son took farewell of me, the only son I ever bore. From the doorway I watched him go down the street of the city, and I heard the people shout as he went amongst them, they glorying in my son's splendid appearance. Ah, that I might live to see his return, and to hear the shouts that will go up when the people look on Jason again. And I know that my life will not be spared so long. I will not look on my son when he comes back from the dangers he will run in the quest of the good." And the first children of Athamas were Phrixus and Helle. "Ah, Phrixus, and ah, Helle," Alcmene lamented, "what griefs you have brought in the race of Aeolus! What griefs you yourselves suffered! The evil that Athamas your father did you lives to be a curse to the line of Aeolus. Athamas was wedded first to Nephele, the mother of Phrixus and Helle, the youth and maiden. But Athamas married again while the mother of these children was still living, and Ino, the new queen, drove Nephele and her children out of the king's palace. And now was Nephele most unhappy. She had to live as a servant, and her children were servants to the servants of the palace. They were clad in rags and had little to eat, and they were beaten often by the servants who wished to win the favor of the new queen. But although they wore rags and had menial tasks to do, Phrixus and Helle looked the children of a queen. The boy was tall, and in his eyes there often came the flash of power, and the girl looked as if she would grow into a lovely maiden. And when Athamas their father would meet them by chance, he would sigh, and Queen Ino would know by that sigh that he still had some love for them in his heart. Afterward she would have to use all the power she possessed to win the king back from thinking upon his children. And now Queen Ino had children of her own. She knew that the people reverenced the children of Nephele, and cared nothing for her children. And because she knew this, she feared that when Athamas died, Phrixus and Helle, the children of Nephele, would be brought to rule in Thebes. Then she and her children would be made to change places with them. This made Queen Ino think on ways by which she could make Phrixus and Helle lose their lives. She thought long upon this, and at last a desperate plan came into her mind. When it was winter, she went amongst the women of the countryside, and she gave them jewels and clothes for presents. Then she asked them to do secretly an unheard-of thing. She asked the women to roast over their fires to be sacrificed on the morrow. Nephele nearly went wild in her grief. And then suddenly there came into her mind the thought of a creature that might be a help to her and to her children. This creature was a ram that had wings and a wonderful fleece of gold. The god of the sea, Poseidon, had sent this wonderful ram to Athamas and Nephele as a marriage gift, and the ram had since been kept in a special fold. To that fold Nephele went. She spent the night beside the ram, praying for its help. The morning came, and the children were taken from their prison and dressed as white, and wreaths were put upon their heads to mark them as things for sacrifice. They were led in a procession to the temple of Artemis. Behind that procession King Athamas walked, his head bowed in shame. But Queen Ino's head was not bowed. Rather she carried it high, for her thought was all upon triumph. Soon Phrixus and Helle would be dead, and then would never happen. Her own children would reign after Athamas in Thebes. Phrixus and Helle, thinking that they were taking their last look at the sun, went on. And even then Nephele, holding the horns of the golden ram, was making her last prayer. The sun rose, and as it did, the ram spread out its great wings and flew through the air. It flew to the temple of Artemis. Down beside the altar came the golden ram, and it stood with its horns threatening those who came. All stopped in surprise. Still the ram stood with threatening head with its golden wings spread out. Then Phrixus ran from those who were holding him, and laid his hands upon the ram. He called to Helle, and she too came to the golden creature. Phrixus mounted on the ram, and he pulled Helle up beside him. Then the golden ram flew upward. Colchis. The king was in the street of the city, and he joined the crowd that gathered around the strange golden creature that had a youth upon its back. The ram folded its wings, and then the youth stood beside it. He spoke to the people, and then the king, Aeetes was his name, spoke to him, asking him from what place he had come, and what was the strange creature upon whose back he had flown. To the king and to the people Phrixus told his story, weeping to tell of Helle and her father. Then King Aeetes brought him into the city, and he gave him a place in the palace, and for the golden ram he had a special fold made. Soon after the ram died, and then King Aeetes took its golden fleece and hung it upon an oak tree that was in a place dedicated to Ares, the god of war. Phrixus wed one of the daughters of the king, and men say that afterward he went back to Thebes, his own land. And as for the golden fleece, it became the greatest of King Aeetes' treasures. Well indeed does he guard it, and not with armed men only, but with magic powers. Very strong and very cunning is King Aeetes, and a terrible task awaits those who would take away from him that fleece of gold. So Alcimede spoke, sorrowfully telling to the women the story of the golden fleece that her son Jason was going in quest of. So she spoke, and the night waned, and the morning of the sailing of the Argo came on. And when the Argonauts beheld the dawn upon the high peaks of Pelion, they arose and poured out wine and offering to Zeus, the highest of the gods. Then Argo herself gave forth a strange cry, for the beam from Dodona that had been formed from her prow had imbued her with life. She uttered a strange cry, and as she did, the heroes took their places at the benches one after the other, as had been arranged by lot, and Tiphys the helmsman went to the steering place. To the sound of Orpheus's lyre they smote with oars the rushing sea water, and the surge broke over the oar blades. The sails were let out, and the breeze came into them, piping shrilly, and the fishes came darting through the green sea, small and great, and followed them, gambolling along the watery grass. And Chiron, the king centaur, came down from the mountain of Pelion, and standing with his feet in the foam, cried out, "Good speed, O Argonauts, good speed, and a sorrowless return." The beginning of things. Orpheus sang to him,
Rather would he have been enraged if one of them married, for now his heart was set upon winning her for his bride, and he cursed himself for not having entered the race. She passed the last goal mark, and she was given the victor's wreath of flowers. Hippomenes stood and watched her, and did not see the youths who had started with her. They had thrown themselves on the ground in their despair. Then wild, as though he were one of the doomed youths, Hippomenes made his way through the throng and came before the black-bearded king of Boeotia. The king's brows were knit, for even then he was pronouncing doom upon the youths who had been left behind in the race. He looked upon Hippomenes, another youth who would make the trial, and the frown became heavier upon his face. But Hippomenes saw only Atalanta. She came beside her father, the wreath was upon her head of gold, and her eyes were wide and tender. She turned her face to him, and then she knew by the wildness that was in his look that he had come to end things with her. Then the flush that was on her face died away, and she shook her head as if she were imploring him to go from that place. The dark-bearded king bent his brows upon him and said, "Speak, O youth, and tell us what brings you here." Then cried Hippomenes, as if his whole life were bursting out with his words, "Why does this maiden, your daughter, seek an easy renown by conquering weakly youths in the race? She has not striven yet. Here stand I, one of the blood of Poseidon, the god of the sea. Should I be defeated by her in the race, then indeed might Atalanta have something to boast of." Atalanta stepped forward and said, "Do not speak of it, youth. Indeed I think that it is some good, envious of your beauty and your strength. Who sent you here to strive with me and to meet your doom?
Ah, think of the youths who have striven with me even now. Think of the hard doom that is about to fall upon them. You venture your life in the race, but indeed I am not worthy of the prize. Go hence, O stranger, go hence wounded happily, for indeed I think that there is some maiden who loves you well. Nay, maiden, said his maiden, I will enter the race, and I will venture my life on the chance of winning you for my bride. What good will my life birth be to me if they cannot win this race for me? She drew away from him then, and looked upon him no more, but bent down to fasten the sandals upon her feet. And the black-bearded king looked upon Hippomenes and said, Face then this race tomorrow. You will be the only one who will enter it, but you think really of the doom that awaits you at the end of it. The king said no more, and Hippomenes went from him and from Atalanta, and he came again to the place where the race had been run. He looked across the sandy course with its gold marks, and in his mind he saw again Atalanta's swift race. He would not meet doom at the hands of the king's soldiers, he knew, for his spirit relieved him with the greatness of the effort he would make to go before her. And he thought it would be well to second of the shining apples. The apple rolled before her, and rolled off the course. Atalanta turned off the course, and picked up the apple. Then did Hippomenes draw all his spirit into his breast as he raced on. He was now nearer to the goal than she was, but he knew that she was behind him, going lightly where he went heavily. And then she was beside him, and then she went past him. She paused in her speed for a moment, and she looked back on him. As he raced on, his chest seemed weighted down, and his throat was cracked dry. The goal marks were far away still, but Atalanta was nearing them. He took the last of the golden apples into his hand. Perhaps she was now so far that the strength of his throw would not be great enough to bring the apple before her. But with all the strength he could put into his hand, he flung the apple. It struck the course before her feet, and then went bounding wide. Atalanta swerved in her race, and followed where the apple went. Hippomenes marveled that he had been able to fling it so far. He saw Atalanta stoop to pick up the apple, and he bounded on. And then, although his strength was failing, he saw the goal marks near him. He set his feet between them, and then fell down on the ground. The attendants raised him up and put the victor's wreath upon his head. The concourse of people shouted with joy to see him victor. But he looked around for Atalanta, and he saw her standing there with the golden apples in her hands. He has won, he heard her say, and I have not to hate myself for bringing a doom upon him. Gladly do I give up the race, and glad am I that it is this youth who has won the victor from me. She took his hand and brought him before the king. Then Schenius, in the sight of all the rejoicing people, gave Atalanta to Hippomenes for his bride, and he bestowed upon him also a great gift of horses. With his dear and hard-won bride, Hippomenes went to his own country, and the apples that she brought with her, the golden apples of Aphrodite, were reverenced by the people. End of section 9. Please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alana Aslan. The Golden Fleece and the Heroes Who Lived Before Achilles by Parik Kolam. Part 1. The Voyage to Colchis. Chapter 10. The Departure from Lemnos. A day came when Heracles left the Argo and went on the Lemnian land. He gathered the heroes about him, and they, seeing Heracles come amongst them, clamored to go to hunt the wild bulls that were inland from the sea. So for once, the heroes left the Lemnian maidens who were their friends. Jason, too, left Sibylle in the palace and went with Heracles. And as they went, Heracles spoke to each of the heroes, saying that they were forgetting the fleece of gold that they had sailed to gain. Jason blushed to think that he had almost let go out of his mind the quest that had brought him from Iolcus. And then he thought upon Hypsipyle, and of how her little hand would stay in his, and his own hand became loose upon the spear, so that it nearly fell from him. How could he thought, leave Hypsipyle in this land of Lemnos behind? He heard the clear voice of Atalanta as she, too, spoke to the Argonauts. What Heracles said was grave and wise, said Atalanta. Forgetfulness would cover their sins if they stayed longer in Lemnos. Forgetfulness and shame, and they would come to despise themselves. Leave Lemnos, she cried, and draw our going to the sea, and depart for Colchis. All day the Argonauts stayed by themselves, hunting the bulls. On their way back from the chase, they were met by Lemnian maidens who carried wreaths of flowers for them. Very silent were the heroes of the Heracles went with Jason to the palace, and Hypsipyle, seeing the mighty stranger coming, seated herself on the couch where she was wont to sit looking into the face of Jason, and on the stone throne of King Thoas, her father. And seated on that throne, she spoke to Jason and to Heracles as a queen might speak. In the hall that night, the heroes and the Lemnian maidens who were with them were quiet. A story was told. Castor began it, and Polydeuces ended it. And the story that Heracles told was the Golden Maid. Epimetheus the Titan had a brother who was the wisest of all humans, Prometheus, called the Foreseer. But Epimetheus himself was slow-witted and scatterbrained. His wise brother once sent him a message, bidding him beware of the gifts that Zeus might send him. Epimetheus heard, but he did not heed the warning, and thereby he brought upon the racing men troubles and cares. Prometheus, the wise Titan, had saved men from a great trouble that Zeus would have brought upon them. Also, he had given the gift of fire. Zeus was the more wroth with men now because fire, stolen from him, had been given them. He was wroth with the race of Titans too, and he pondered in his heart how he might injure men, and how he might use Epimetheus, the mindless Titan, to further his plan. While he pondered, there was a hush on high Olympus, the mountain of the gods. Then Zeus called upon the artisan of the gods, named Hephaestus, and he commanded him to make a being out of clay that would have the likeness of a lovely maiden. With joy and pride, Hephaestus worked at the task that had been given him, and he fashioned a being that had the likeness of a lovely maiden, and he brought the thing of his making before the gods and goddesses. All strove to add a grace or a beauty to the work of Hephaestus. Zeus granted the maiden should see and feel. Athena dressed her in garments that were as lovely as flowers. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, put a charm on her lips and in her eyes. The Graces put necklaces around her neck and set a golden crown upon her head. The Hours brought her a girdle of spring flowers. Then the herald of the gods gave her speech that was sweet and flowing. All the gods and goddesses had given gifts to her, and for that reason, the maiden of Hephaestus' making was called Pandora, the all-endowed. She was lovely, the gods knew, not beautiful as they themselves, who have a beauty that awakens reverence rather than love, but lovely, as flowers and bright waters and earthly maidens are lovely. Zeus smiled to himself when he looked upon her, and he called to Hermes, who knew all the ways of the earth, and he put her into the charge of Hermes. Also, he gave Hermes great joy to take along. This jar was Pandora's dower. Epimetheus lived in a deep down valley. Now one day, as he was sitting on a fallen pillar in the ruined place that was now forsaken by the rest of the Titans, he saw a pair coming toward him. One had wings, and he knew him to be Hermes, the messenger of the gods. The other was a maiden. Epimetheus marveled at the crown upon her head and at her lovely garments. There was a glint of gold all around her. He rose from where he sat upon the broken pillar. Hermes, he saw, was carrying by its handle a great jar. In wonder and delight, he looked upon the maiden. Epimetheus had seen no lovely thing for ages. Wonderful indeed was this golden maiden, and as she came nearer, the charm that was on her lips and in her eyes came to the earth-born one, and he smiled with more and more delight. Hermes came and stood before him.